Good evening and welcome back to the final lesson in our study, Believe in Me, Jesus, in the Gospel of John. And before we begin today, I want to give a little bit of information, even though I'll do a little video about it, but I want to give a little information on our next study, which we're calling Ezekiel, Fiery Throne, and Dry Bones. And these are references to Ezekiel 1 and chapter 37. And Ezekiel is a prophetic book. It's something that isn't usually studied because it's very strange. Ezekiel was one of the exiles that actually left Judah and went to Babylon. I just see my light is off. Let me turn my light on. There we go. I'm a little less shadow now. Left Judah and was taken to Babylon with the first sort of wave of exiles. And he has these fantastic visions of the glory of God, of the fiery throne of God that echoes Exodus. He performs what we call prophetic sign acts, where he acts out a thing, and then that's how he tells the will of God and the message of God to the people through this. He draws Jerusalem on a clay tablet and then sets up siege works in miniature around his clay tablet, stuff like that. So it's different, but it has so many ties to the rest of Scripture. I already mentioned Exodus. It points back to Exodus and draws on that. It draws on maybe Elisha's fiery chariot with the fiery chariot throne of God. Elijah, I think I said Elisha, but I meant Elijah. It points forward to Revelation, because a lot of the images in Revelation are actually drawn from Ezekiel. So if we study Revelation later, we'll see what we've learned from Ezekiel will carry through, and we'll be able to see that rich meaning as the author of Revelation uses it as a reference and an allusion that allows him to layer meaning. It shows up in the teachings of Jesus, as we saw when we did the Good Shepherd lesson. And really, it makes connections for the way that God will bring the new covenant as a fulfillment of the old covenant. And so we're starting this study on January 7th and 8th. It'll be 13 lessons over the spring semester. And I have a whole page on it at deannamunger.com/Ezekiel. So any questions on our Ezekiel study? All right. Well, today we're completing John with the crucifixion and resurrection in John 19 and 18 through 20, really. But we'll begin by reviewing last week's lesson. So Jesus was in last week's lesson, we were in the long 4-chapter session of Jesus teaching that is in between the action of the dinner at which Jesus washes his disciples' feet and the betrayal scene that we're going to start with tonight. And so there's this long section of teaching. Anyone remembers anything that stood out to you from that lesson about Jesus, the true vine?
You do have a lot of contrast between him and Judas and the betrayal that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's connected all the way through. Even beginning, the foot washing scene is really where that starts. And it does follow through where what Jesus will do and how he will act out the love that he is talking about in those sessions it keeps being related to Judas. And it's this idea of, a betrayal of Jesus is why we need Jesus' sacrifice. And Jesus chooses to undergo betrayal hatred, suffering for the love of his disciples. Yeah, and that runs all the way through that section. Yeah, good point. What else?
I know we talked about this Tuesday morning a little bit. We were talking about how in the Old Testament, how they taught had the vine, and in the New Testament, how we showed Jesus is the vine.
Yeah, yeah. So um, over and over, we got a metaphor of Israel as the vine in the Old Testament. And we had specifically done a passage out of Isaiah, but I gave you a couple more. And Israel was a vine that God did everything for, but they still produced bad grapes. They were bad at being the vine. And so Jesus comes as I am the true vine. Jesus is the the word scholars use is recapitulation. It's this it's the renew and redo of the vine, or of all of Israel, is in Jesus. Jesus is the new Israel as the true vine, and Jesus can produce good fruit. And so then our role becomes to abide in Jesus, and his fruit becomes our fruit. Yeah, what else?
Well, and piggybacking on that, um, God starts to care for the vine, and so and we're the branches in that, and so yeah, there's going to be bad things, but there's pruning involved. We're going to evolve. We're going to become better. We're not automatically perfect. We're learning as we go.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
there's
and that
also
learning process is talked about as pruning, which doesn't always sound pleasant, does it?
mm-mm.
And yet that's completely different from being cut off from that is part of God's caretaking of the vine, is to be taught, is to be pruned, is to be helped to grow in our ability to obey Jesus. And he gives a command. What is the big command that fulfills abiding in Jesus?
You're gonna you're gonna love others. You're gonna sacrifice and live like he has, and you're gonna go through a lot of pain.
Yeah,
He really
it's
starts to get into that.
yeah. Love one another, which includes lowly service like the foot washing, all the way to the great self sacrifice of the cross. And he says, you will experience the same kind of hatred that I'm going to experience. And so when we see that in today's lesson, that suffering, that hatred that Jesus experiences, we go, I remember that Jesus told them to expect this, and told them that he was choosing to undergo that treatment for the love of his friends. We also talked about how we are his friends because we get to know the things of God. He says a slave doesn't isn't told the master's business, but you are my friends. And so Jesus tells us about God's mission and invites us to participate in God's purposes. And so we expect to be a real part of what God is doing in the world, which will include that resistance, but will also include all of the good things that God is doing, and all of it enabled by the Helper, or the Holy Spirit, or the Spirit of Truth. We saw several names for this person, who guides us into all truth. Any other comments on last week's? Well, let's start with John 18, 1 through 11. Would someone read that?
I'll read.
Thank you.
When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers and chief priests and Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let them go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken of those whom he gave me. I have lost not one. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?"
Thank you. Okay, so the action resumes here after that long section of teaching we talked about. And John doesn't tell us that this garden is named Gethsemane like the synoptics do, but this is likely that same garden. And it seems like it's an enclosed place because they enter it. Right. And it does sound like, since Jesus often met there with his disciples, that it may be that this kind of teaching that we just got 4 concentrated chapters of was probably a part of Jesus' ministry along and along, and that John had gathered it in this powerful way over those 4 chapters. Okay, so we have a scene in the garden, and who all shows up? Bethany, you are muted. I think you're answering.
You've
There.
got Pharisees, high priests, Judas. You've got the Roman soldiers. I think you said there's like 600 of them.
Yeah, I noticed your translation said a band. The word here is the word for a Roman cohort, which is the sixth of a legion, or 600 men. So if it's being used in a technical sense, that is a lot of soldiers. And if it's not being used in a technical sense, then it's probably indicating there's still a lot of soldiers there. And we also have officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. And later we see we even have a servant. So this is a big group. What do they have with them? Verse 3.
They have torches and they
Mhm.
have swords.
Yeah. Torches and
Weapons.
weapons.
Which, oh yeah, and they
Yeah.
had lanterns because it was night.
Because it was night, right? So, what is the emotional tenor of this scene? What is this like?
Well, it's at night, so you have that the day versus night theme carrying through here.
Yeah, John, our author, John, never does that lightly, does he? When things happen at night, it
Yeah.
means something, right? Yeah. Okay, go on.
And then you just have this mass of people that are they just hate Jesus. They want him dead.
Yeah. Yeah, these Pharisees and officers of the chief priests, and they are spitting mad. They want to take him down. And then you have all of these soldiers, right? What outcomes are possible when you bring 600 armed men ready to take down a fugitive? What
Slaughter.
is that? What?
A slaughter.
Yeah, I mean, we can see that it would be very easy and very likely for great violence to break out. Jesus has all of his disciples with him, so it would be the 11, and some scholars think even more of his disciples were with him. And so, like, this is a large group, and Jesus and his disciples are in the enclosure, and all of these soldiers are coming in. They're coming in with weapons. And so this is very highly charged, a very dangerous scene. And why does it say that Jesus goes forth to talk to them in verse 4?
It's probably to not have anything burst, any fights start out, just kind of calm everything down, keep it
Yeah.
peaceful.
Yeah. And he does show that concern. Where do you see that concern later?
Well, I mean, he's talking about let the others go, but that also is fulfilling part of his prayer that he hasn't, not one of his followers has been hurt or killed, or I'm sorry, he hasn't lost any
Yeah,
of his
how it's written.
servants or his disciples.
Yeah, and they are probably in real danger with the
Right. But
way.
there's a singularity of him going to them as well. So you've got one guy going up against all of this other stuff. It's kind of a David and Goliath moment in some respects, except
In some
really
respects,
it's
but
not.
look at why he does that. In verse 4, why, what does it say?
Because he knew
Knowing
it was
all that
going
would
to happen.
happen. Yeah.
Yeah, knowing all things that were coming upon him. So this is the opening of kind of the arrest and trial and crucifixion. And we open with this sense of Jesus knowing all things that were coming upon him. And he asks, okay, who do you seek? And he answers, they say, Jesus, he answers what? What does Jesus answer in verse 5?
I am he.
Okay, this is one of
Well,
those
it's
times.
I am.
It's
Yeah.
I am. Yeah, our translators have added he so that it makes a sentence in English, but it's ego in me in Greek. It's I am. It's the same construction that Jesus ended. I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. And they picked up stones to stone him. It is this same statement of I am that echoes the Hebrew name of God from which we get Yahweh. And how do they react?
They fall to the ground.
Yeah, they drew back and fell to the ground. Why?
I think there's a little bit of God happening there.
Okay.
Like, I
How's
mean,
that?
there's major authority in Jesus,
Yeah.
and something's happening there that's showing the authority of God.
Yeah, I think it's coming his statement of godhood is coming out in power, isn't it?
Mhm.
Roman soldiers would not be likely to get the reference. When Jesus said before Abraham was born, I am, those Jewish leaders got the reference and they were mad about it. But did the Roman soldiers care? I don't think so. Right? I think there is power in this statement, enough to knock back this huge group of soldiers and officers. And this is the final of the 7 I am statements of Jesus. Remember, we have in John, we have 7 I am metaphors. I am the good shepherd. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the light of the world. Well, we also have 7 I ams, and this is the final of them. And so Jesus makes an impact with this claim to be I am the God of Israel at the opening of his arrest. And his show of power is nothing like a military show of power, right? Like, how does the military part of this thing go?
Right. Mm.
Oh, well.
I think it's interesting because I'm looking at the Amplified
Uh-huh.
version, and it says they went backwards and drew back, lurched backwards, and fell to the ground.
They lurched back. Yeah. 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 So the original, Amplified gives you some choices, right? The original has the one, right? They fell back and they fell to the ground. But you could, I like lurched back. Yeah, it sounds staggering. Yeah. So the military part, we have one sword-based interaction, right? This is an event that is described in some other gospels, but they never name names. John is in here naming names, right? Instead of one of them cut off the servant's ear, it's Peter. Simon Peter did it. He's the one who cut off the servant's ear. Um, and you notice John does not. I had not noticed this until someone pointed out to me yesterday. John doesn't even tell us that Jesus heals the ear like some of the other gospels tell us. We just move on from that, right? The servant's name was Malchus. And so the military part of this conflict is minimized, right? Jesus' power here is solely in word, in Jesus' identity, right? So here in this scene, we have to like put ourselves in there to see what a powder keg this would have been, how dangerous this and dark this scene would have been, how the potential for violence was so great here. And yet Jesus is in control. He knows what's about to happen. He's manifesting the power of his identity as I am, and he is ensuring that every one of his disciples are let go safely. Other questions or comments on this scene?
I think it's kind of interesting because after they fell to the ground, they asked him again, who are you? The second time, like in verse
Yeah. Well,
verse
he had
8.
to, I guess just because all they did was fall down, he had to ask them again, who do you seek? And they answer again, Jesus the Nazarene. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. What else? Anything else on this that you guys want to talk about? Well, we are going to skip a little bit ahead over the scene with Annas and Caiaphas. This is the high priest and the father-in-law of the high priest, who was previously a high priest, and there's a brief audience with each of them. But there's not really a trial described, because remember that Jesus has been on trial in John since chapter 5 with the Jewish authorities when they began to persecute, or we might even say prosecute them. We talked about that. So his trial with them, where he is testifying about himself and they are questioning the validity of his testimony, and all of that, that trial type language has been going on all that time. And so the main trial content in John is before Pilate. So would someone read John 18:28 through 40? This is going to be the first half of the Pilate scene.
I can.
Go for it, Shirley.
28 through 40.
Yes.
Then they brought Jesus from Caiaphas into the Patron judgment hall, governor's palace. And it was early. They themselves did not enter the Patron, that they might not be defiled, become ceremonially unclean, but they may fit to eat the Passover supper. So Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you have against this man? They retorted, if he were not an evildoer criminal, we would have not have handed him over to you. Pilate said to him, take him yourselves and judge and sentence and punish him according to your own laws. The Jews answered, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." Was to fulfill the word which Jesus had spoken, to show by what manner of death he was to die. So Pilate went back again to the judgment hall and called Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "Are you saying this of yourself on your own initiative, or others have told you about me?" Pilate said, "Am I a Jew? Your own people and nation and their chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingship, royal power, belongs not to this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from this world, has no uh, origin or source." Pilate said to him, "Then you are the king." Jesus answered, "You say it. You speak correctly, for I am a king. Certainly I'm a king. This is why I was born, and this is why I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth, who is a friend of the truth, belongs to the truth, hears and listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is the truth?" On saying this, he went out, and the Jews again told him, "I found no fault in him. But it is your custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. So shall I release you for the king of the Jews?" And they shouted back again, "Not him, not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber.
Okay, I love it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. That word robber is a word for a bandit, but it also implies banditing and probably an insurrection type movement. So, that tells you, a little bit, even though robber is a translation, it's a little bit more than robber. Okay. Going back to verse 28. Why won't they go in, the officials there? Why don't they go into Pilate's house or to the praetorium? A praetorium is a title that would be used for the residence of the Roman governor. So it's Pilate's house. Pilate is a Gentile. Why won't they go in?
They don't want to defile themselves so they can eat the Passover meal.
Yes, they're very careful, right?
Yes.
They really care about the law and doing the right thing right here at the beginning, right? This is sort of a little bit of I don't know,
Hypocrisy.
satire, sarcasm, something here at this opening. Would you say, Bethany?
Hypocrisy.
Yeah, yeah, hypocrisy. Yeah, because they're trying to do a thing that is not consistent with goodness and rightness, but they're going to follow the letter of the law, right? What's going on? Okay, look at verse 29 through 32. What is going on in this initial conversation between Pilate and the Jewish officials?
Well, Pilate's telling them to, take Jesus back. This is your thing. He hasn't done anything as far as I can see, and they're refusing because they refuse. They can't kill him.
Yeah,
They
they
need
don't,
Pilate to
he
do
does not want to get involved in their religious matter. And they say they aren't permitted to put him to death. And so some scholars have said that, oh, Roman law must not allow them the death penalty. And that's why they say that. But if that's the case, it's a little, Pilate both encourages them to take them back and judge him according to their law here. And in 19:7, he says, you take him and crucify him. And so maybe Pilate that is like issuing a challenge that he knows he can call their bluff. Or maybe that's not the case. Some scholars have thought that it's not that they couldn't legally execute by Roman law, but they felt they did not have enough to legally execute Jesus according to Mosaic law. Like they just don't think they can justify it, but they want to get it done anyway. And so they want the Romans to do it for them. Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, this is just a solid legal argument. If this man were not a criminal,
Right?
we would not have handed him over to you.
Right. It's funny how they don't even give a charge. They just say there must be one.
Yeah, and then later on, when Jesus speaks, finally, he's eloquent.
Yeah.
He's got reasons.
Yeah.
This is pretty funny. I
And
mean,
it is
not
funny.
funny, haha. Yeah.
No, but I think that that contrast is intended here, especially as it's opened with the ceremonial point about there being ceremonial unclean. You know, John could have left that out. Like, he didn't have to say that Pilate came out. He could have just told us what they said to each other. He leaves plenty of stuff out, right? But he put that in. And so I think your point is it goes along with the intent there, is what how I read it.
I was thinking also when you're talking about making them, the Romans did it, that they could also use that as an excuse if the people were upset. They could say, well, we didn't do it. It was the Romans that did it. The
Yeah.
awful Romans that we've been telling you about forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it absolved them also of it.
Yeah, I think that's a
And
great
probably
point.
in their, maybe in their mind that it was, well, the Romans are doing it, so it's not us, right? Like, we're not the ones that are doing this.
Yeah, we're
That's
innocent of blood.
yes, exactly. Well, the Romans wouldn't have done it if he wasn't a bad guy or whatever.
Same logic as we wouldn't have handed him over if he wasn't a criminal.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great point. Yeah, definitely. And we see that how this is all adding up is verse 32. This was to fulfill the word of Jesus, which Jesus spoke, signifying by what death he was about to die. What is that talking about? What does that line mean?
Well, there's another kind of betrayal going on here.
Okay.
It's his own people.
Mm.
And it's not just Judas, it's the leaders of the people of the king, he's king of these people. This is kind of an E2 Brutus moment, although he knows that it's happening. So there's this doubling down of he's dying because of a betrayal, because of the lies, because of the sin of the
Because they've
Israelites.
been persecuting him. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
All
mean,
this
it's just that
come
whole.
to a complete, head here.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And there is something here where if they would have executed him, and remember the times that they were going to execute him for blasphemy, they picked up stones to stone him. But that is not the verse 32 kind of death he was about to die. We remember that Jesus said, he said to Nicodemus at night, as Moses lifted up the servant in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And in chapter 12, and if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. And so Jesus is to die by crucifixion, not by stoning. And so this back and forth with the Jews and the Romans is what creates the situation where he can be crucified. And that is a lifting up from the earth. What is Jesus accused of? What is the thing? What's the crime? Besides just being an evildoer.
He's the king of the Jews.
Yeah, being a king, right? So this is a charge, like for the Romans, this would translate to a charge of insurrection, of trying to make himself king. Um, and his opponents seem to have told Pilate that. John skips over them telling him, and we just see Pilate come in, and it's out of Pilate's mouth, King, King, King. Notice he says it over and over again. Why is this so repeated in this section?
It's satirical irony. He is the king.
Right, right. There's this dramatic irony where Pilate is asking, but in reality, the reader knows Jesus is the king, right? So Jesus asserts his kingship is from above, and Pilate answers, he says, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. What does Pilate ask him?
My version says, "What is truth?"
Yeah.
What is truth? Yeah. Yeah, is he saying that philosophically? Is he saying that nervously? I think the reader is invited to understand that the deepest truth that can be offered in any case here is that Jesus is king. The truth is, Jesus is the king that he has been claiming to be here. And though his kingdom is not of this world, it is a real kingdom with real power that Jesus is just holding back this whole time. Let's read the last half of the Pilate scene. It's 19, 1 through 22.
I'll read again.
Thanks.
Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man!" When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to the law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote as inscription and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, this man said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we see in verses 1 through 3 a continuation of that dramatic irony that y'all mentioned, right? Jesus is in reality king. He deserves a real crown. He deserves a real robe. He deserves to be given tribute that is not slaps in the face, but is real tribute. And so there is this hatred and abuse, and this is what he told the disciples to expect that he would undergo this, that they would undergo this. And so we see that he is choosing to suffer these things in silence out of his love for his friends. And how is Pilate feeling by now? Look at verse 8.
He's scared.
Yeah.
He does not want to have anything to do with this. He keeps trying to give him back to the Jews, and they just keep making it harder and harder.
Yeah. So we have two things. We have Pilate being even more afraid, which is interesting because more than what, Pilate's fear has not previously been mentioned. Although, maybe we were supposed to sense his unease from what is truth, but that's far from saying he was fearful. And now he is even more afraid, or that may just mean very afraid. What do you think has made him so fearful? He's trying to release Jesus. He goes back and forth. He seems to make an effort. Yeah. What's made him afraid?
I think it's a lot of peer pressure.
Yeah, he's definitely at the end, and we'll talk about why, but he is definitely backed into a corner at the end of this thing.
Yeah, I mean, he's afraid, he's afraid if he doesn't do it, then, he's gonna have trouble with Caesar because of the big stink that they're making, right? If Caesar
Yeah.
hears about this, why didn't you kill this guy? Awful
Yeah,
fear.
so a couple of things, right? He knows he's in the middle of an internal fight. Like, what is a extremely dangerous situation for like police to respond to? A domestic violence situation. You don't when you get in between people's internal fights, you put yourself in danger. And I think we see that in
Mhm.
Pilate, that he understands that. He also has a responsibility to keep the city from any mob violence, and here they are with their rabid away with him, crucify. And so it does seem like mob violence could be a real risk. Also, think about how someone with a Roman worldview would hear the statement, he made himself out to be the Son of God. This would be a category that is not the same category as the Hebrews meant it,
Mhm.
and yet someone not to be messed with. Think about all your Greek and Roman mythology, right? You just don't go mess with a son of the gods. And so Pilate wants out. He's like, let me humiliate this guy, and that'll be enough to pacify you, and we can release him. And it doesn't work. Notice what they say that shifts him to the judgment seat. What is the thing that they say that changes it? This is in verse 12.
Yeah, this is where they're starting to pit him against Caesar. If
Okay.
you don't do this, you're not Caesar's friend.
You're not Caesar's friend. It turns out that friend of Caesar is actually a technical term for a privileged status that was awarded by the emperor. And so certain people would be awarded the title friend of Caesar. And if they were displeasing, it could be taken away. And there's historical evidence that Pilate may have had his friend of Caesar status because he was associated with another Roman official named Aelius Sejanus, assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was strongly anti-Jewish, and he had been a friend of Caesar, and a bunch of his um, contemporaries were awarded friend of Caesar by association with him. Then he lost his friend of Caesar's status, Aelius Sejanus did, and so Pilate's just hanging out there, vulnerable, right? And a complaint from the Jews could be particularly damaging to him. And so Pilate politically is very much backed into a corner. And so he's like, if you're going to bring out the friend of Caesar thing, I'll just he sits down on the judgment seat and passes judgment. Yet another, Jesus deserves the judgment seat. Pilate sits on the judgment seat and passes judgment. What is the Jewish leader's final cry in verse 15? This is a crazy thing for them to say.
We have no king but Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's just chilling. All the way through the Old Testament, Yahweh was the true king of the Israelites. Always. The king was king for it's all David's all. These were king by anointing by God. God was the true king always. And so they have denounced Yahweh's kingship. In denouncing Jesus, they have ended up denouncing God the Father. This is the very thing that Jesus has been saying all along. If you don't recognize me, you don't recognize the Father. If you don't accept me, you don't accept the Father. And all along they've been saying, no, we are the fathers. We have God as our Father, just not you. And here it has brought them all the way to the point of pointing their kingship to this evil human regime of Rome and denouncing their God as king. And so that betrayal that you talked about, Bethany, the inability to to follow God without following Jesus is that Jesus has been trying to tell them all along is on display right here. Well, Pilate was pressured, but he makes his own point in the end, right? He gets in one last jab. What does he do? And why do you think he does it?
He writes on the plaque, he is the king of the Jews, right?
Yeah.
In all the different languages.
Yes, multiple languages. It's in Hebrew, so it's meant to be read. That's probably meant to indicate Aramaic. It's meant to be read by Jews, right? He's the king of the Jews, and they want no. Say he says he's the king of the Jews. Pilate. He may do it only out of fear to mitigate his culpability for this Son of God that he's suddenly afraid of. He may do it to stick it to the Jews because they have pressured him politically and forced his hand here. But the reader knows the truth. Here is the King of the Jews. And the most kingly thing that Jesus does is to sacrifice his own life. The God of the universe is giving up himself in self-giving love. This is what it means to be the King of the Jews. Well, the next section is a sequence of 3 vignettes or mini scenes of Jesus in the crucifixion. So in verse 23 through 24, we have the scene of the 4 Roman soldiers. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part to every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. So they said to one another, "Let's not tear it, but cast lots for it to decide whose it shall be." And this was to fulfill scripture. They divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore, the soldiers did these things. Why is it important enough for John to tell us about Jesus' clothing?
Because it's fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, there's a prophecy here and it does fulfill it. Why does it matter? Not why does prophecy matter, but why does this clothing matter?
That's all that he had was just his clothing.
Hmm.
He did not have anything else.
This is his earthly possessions. This is everything he has. If he had valuables in his pockets, they would have divided that up too. What they have taken from Jesus is everything he owns. And so, this first vignette, Jesus lets go of all his possessions. Verse 25 through 27, we have Jesus' family. But standing by the cross were his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene, I think John assumes his readers will know who she is, but this is the first mention of her in this gospel. So we have these 4 women. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And he said to his disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his whole household. And so the effect of this vignette is that Jesus has let go of his family, his mother, right? His mother is taken into the household of his friend that he loves, and he has let go of his people, the people that have loved him and followed him and supported him. Verse 28 through 30, after this, Jesus, knowing all things had already been accomplished to fulfill scripture, said, "I am thirsty." And a jar full of sour wine was standing there. And so they put a sponge full of sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it up to his mouth. Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So here in verse 28, we see Jesus knows what?
The reason why he came has been fulfilled.
Everything has been accomplished. We opened the arrest with Jesus knew all things that were coming. And here at the end, he knows all things have come. And he accomplishes one last scripture by being given vinegar to drink. This is a passage from Psalm 69. And how does Jesus die?
He bows his head and gives up his spirit after proclaiming it's done.
He says it's done, and he gives up his spirit. We see with this, John 10:17 through 18 reads, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it up again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. And this commandment I received from my Father." And so in these 3 mini scenes, we see Jesus has given up his possessions, given over his loved ones, and now given up his life itself. And Jesus still remains in control. He is where he is by choice. And his gracious choice is to give everything into his life for the salvation of mankind. Thoughts or questions on these passages?
I did notice in John it doesn't mention this, but I know in the other gospels it mentions the thieves on the cross. They were ridiculing him also, and one of them said, this guy didn't do anything wrong. He says, please remember me when you're in paradise. And Jesus said, yes.
Yeah. John gives a very spare telling of this, right? It's a very powerful telling, but it doesn't, it's lean. It's a tight description here. And we mention these two men, one on each side, and it's almost like they're only mentioned so that John can tell us later that their legs are broken and Jesus are not. None of the story of those men is included. Yeah, it is a very powerful effect here. Other thoughts? Well, I hope you got a chance to read, or you will get a chance to read the rest of chapter 19 and chapter 20, because John takes us through so many wonderful moments. And some of these really close questions that have been open in John this whole time. Since chapter 3, we've been wondering about Nicodemus. He came at night, and it was just put out for the reader. Will he be a true disciple? Will he decide to follow Jesus? And so here in chapter 19, we get Joseph of Arimathea, someone we have not met before in John's gospel, but someone who's mentioned in all four gospels, who is a secret disciple for fear of the Jews, and Nicodemus, who we know came at night. But these two, instead of staying in the dark, they come in the daylight and they become true disciples of Jesus, disciples who are willing to follow Jesus openly, and they bring this this abundant amount of spices and take care of Jesus' body. And so we see, Nicodemus, he did choose Jesus, and the reader is invited, make this choice, make this same choice to follow Jesus openly, to become a true disciple. In chapter 20, in verses 3 through 10, we get a very interesting scene. It switches styles a little bit because it isn't spare anymore. We get all of this detail about the disciples racing to the empty tomb. We get who ran further and how the linen strips were laid and who looked into the tomb and then came back and looked again. And all of this detail speaks to the eyewitness character of this crucial moment in the history of mankind and in the witness of the story of Jesus. I think John wants us to know this is reliable eyewitness testimony by including the story of the way that they run to the tomb. And the only person to whom Jesus appears at the tomb is Mary Magdalene, a woman, and hers is the only encounter there. And she is the one that is sent with a mission to tell the good news of the resurrection. And so, yet another woman, we saw Martha with her great confession. We see here another woman that holds a privileged place. And the Samaritan woman at the well, another woman that holds a privileged place in this gospel. Well, John ends his book with his own comments on his testimony. In John 21, 24 through 25, he says, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things. And we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written." And so John is telling us, yes, I know I left a lot of things out, but you have the testimony that tells you the truth about Jesus. And that's how he ends. Well, tell me what have been some significant themes or impacts that this book has had on you through the study.
Uh, First, the question: it, isn't John the oldest disciple or apostle to have been have written Jesus' story?
We think so.
Okay.
So, if this is either John the Apostle or John the Elder, it's called. But yes, the he is described as if it's John the Apostle, described as the youngest of the apostles, but the longest lived. And it seems that he writes his gospel after the martyrdom of the other apostles, and he writes the latest, and from the perspective of having lived a lifetime of contemplation of Jesus. And I think that the character of his testimony and the theme of testimony really comes out in the book because of that. It's different than the others, not less true, but it it holds the
Fuller.
weight of his maturity.
It has the full. It's fuller. It's really honing in on, yeah, it's lean in certain places, and maybe it's not in the same order as the others, but it's not an eyewitness account. It's a retrospective. This is who he is, was, has always been, and he was fulfilling every prophecy that the Old Testament ever did. I mean, that's why the crucifixion is so there. It's just boom, 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 one thing after another that he's fulfilling and letting go of. And then and now it's done. I'm gonna check out.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So
there's
I think that sense of it is an eyewitness account, but it's more than an eyewitness account is really strong. Yeah, I agree. And you know, I think it's one of the theories of this book is that John is aware of the other gospels and aware what's in them. And if that is the case, then he knows he can leave out the stuff that they've already covered, right? So like, they have covered the moral instruction of Jesus substantially, and John doesn't include any of it.
Mhm.
It's all about Jesus' identity, that he is from God. He is the Word. He has this pure teaching for 4 chapters. Yeah, that the power of the identity of Jesus and Jesus' control of his ministry and his message. Yeah. What else?
And when Mary Magdalene um, goes there to clean up, and um, and she's so distraught that he's gone, and the person that she thinks is the gardener says, "Who are you looking for?" She says, "Just tell me where you put him, and I'll take care of it." And it is not until he says her name, Mary, that she knows who he is. And there's no part of the Bible that gets me like that. I suppose I'm deranged.
I I find it to be one of the most touching passages.
Yeah, but God has spoken to me on a very few occasions. And the very first thing he says is my name. It's so personal, and he knows this. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Her exclamation of Rabboni is this, that suffix means my rabbi. It's personal. Yeah. Yeah. And this book is like that, right? It's very touching. The man born blind and how he moves in his understanding of Jesus, and then has that encounter where he worships Jesus. This, the woman at the well, like these personal encounters really matter. Paige, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so oftentimes you hear about like when they start doing like Let's Start Talking or something in a foreign country when they're teaching, sometimes they'll do John, you know, and I always thought, why? Like the first chapter is just like, what? What are you talking about? Because it's so like, here's a, here's an analogy, here's a simile, here's a, metaphor and all that stuff. And I just thought that's got to be so confusing. But then like now reading John and thinking about it, it really is just, who is this person? Who is Jesus? And the I am statements, he really is just saying, this is who I am. This is where I have come from. This is what I'm doing here on earth. I'm going back to God. I'm giving you the Holy Spirit. That is so much about who he is, as opposed to, I think sometimes in the other gospels, we just talk about his teachings, right? This is how you treat people. This is how, if someone sins against you, you forgive them, which is all great and fine, that those are good lessons to learn. But learning who Jesus actually, who he said he was and who he was, is so instrumental in learning about him, right? Not just how he said to treat people, but who he actually was.
Yeah.
And the
It's
way,
maybe go ahead.
well, the way it doesn't change. Who I am, I don't know about y'all. It's constantly changing. And Jesus has a grasp who he is from the age of 12 or younger. And it's so grounding for me. This Savior who has always known who he was. I haven't always known that. And I, that's it.
Yeah. It makes me think about the difference between knowing about God and knowing God. And I think John really enriches our ability to know not just about Jesus, but to know Jesus. We have, the theme of light, Jesus being the light of the world, really runs strongly through this gospel. Jesus brings light by giving sight to the blind. He invites us all to step out of the secret darkness and become children of light, become part of his light. Um, and this is the gospel of glory. Jesus talks about how he reveals the nature of the Father, and how the Father reveals Jesus, and they glorify one another. And I think John really points so strongly to the truth about God is that God is so full of love that he would do everything from the lowly service to the washing the disciples' feet all the way to the cross. And John really points that out as well. And so I think, that we take that with us, the model of Jesus' manner, the the point of testimony and how powerful testimony is to change ourselves, to make a difference with others, and how deeply focused on just Jesus himself John is. And if I could just keep my eyes on Jesus the way John has, that would, that would carry me through life. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that I have from this gospel. Other comments, thoughts?
I just, I won't, probably won't add anything to what y'all said already, but just when Jesus distills the commandments down, I think John does that throughout his book. The love of God is just stands out so strong, stands out in John's writing, John's epistles. It's just, it's just beautiful, and the that God became flesh is so strong in this passage. I mean, John just kind of boils it down to the bare, just the heart of everything. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. Well, when Page mentioned that prologue and how it starts off abstract, but John makes it real through the rest of the book. Those principles, we see Jesus living out that light and that love and the testimony that are abstract in the prologue. They get legs and go walking around in the rest of his gospel. I never knew that it would that was a thing in John, right? Like I just okay, we have the prologue and then we have the rest of it. But this idea that the rest of it and the prologue interchange and interpret one another was such a helpful realization and interpretive, like, oh, it is abstract, but it's also completely practical, and we see Jesus living it out.
Yeah. That prologue, I think, is the whole point in this his writing.
Yeah.
This is it, and yeah, it's abstract, and here's how you can do it.
Yeah. Which is amazing because, wow, it's a beautiful passage, but it's a strange passage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, until we read the rest. Well, thank you so much for your excellent participation today and the whole semester. I have loved this study so much. I've been so touched by just the time spent with Jesus, and it's been wonderful going through John with you. So many blessings, Merry Christmas, and Lord willing, we'll be back to study Ezekiel on January 7th and 8th, and I hope you'll join.